Alright, let's go ahead now and we'll start off in PhotoshopCS3 here. So let's launch up the program. And we're going to go ahead and start with some basic preference settings that are going to help us stay on the same page here while we work throughout this series. So go ahead now and press Control-K on the PC, Command-K on the Mac, and that's going to bring up your General Preferences dialog box here. And there's a couple of things that I want you to turn on and a couple of things I want you to turn off while we're working through this dialog box. We're going to start off by turning on Automatically Launch Bridge, because as a photographer you definitely need to start using the bridge as kind of your second hand while you're working with Photoshop. It's going to be a great asset to you for managing your digital files and also for keeping you organized and for launching different files in different applications throughout this series as well. So go ahead and turn on Automatically Launch Bridge. Next we're going to come down here and we're going to turn off Export Clipboard. And I'm going to do that because of the fact that when you switch between applications, if you have a lot of information stored on the clipboard, it's going to be tough to switch between applications without getting error messages or having trouble exporting the clipboard because of not enough memory and different things like that. So we're going to turn that off just to avoid that little hiccup that actually happens quite a lot when you're working between Adobe applications. So we're going to turn that off. Let's move over here to the right hand side and I'm going to turn off Use Shift Key for Tool Switch. What this is going to allow you to do is just have faster access to all the different tools that are on the left-hand side over here in the toolbar when you're working inside of Photoshop. Next thing we're going to do is turn on Zoom Resizes Window. Now this is an option that's automatically turned on Macs, but we're going to go ahead and turn that on the PC as well because it's just helpful for zooming in and out of images and have your image window resize with you so that you don't get lost with the window staying the same size and the image getting bigger. The last thing we're going to take a look at is this zoom with scroll wheel. And you can either turn this on or off. I'm going to give you the option to leave it on or off simply because some people like it and some people don't. I, for one, don't enjoy this. I'm going to go ahead and leave that turned off for now. But if you want to turn that on, go right ahead and do so. Now let's go ahead and we'll click the next button and we're going to move into the interface preferences here. Inside the interface preferences, there's a couple of things I want you to take a look at. The first of which is Used Grayscale Toolbar icon. If you turn that on, you'll notice over here on the left-hand side that the toolbar icon went completely to neutral gray. This is just going to help to keep your eyes from averting to that one spot of color in the user interface. I find a lot of times when you're working inside of Photoshop, you want to minimize the amount of colors you see other than what's in the image window itself, so turning that on and off is actually quite a handy little thing to have. The next thing I want you to make sure that you have turned off is Show Channels in Color. We'll take a look at exactly what this means in a later chapter, but for now we're going to make sure that this is turned off because it's going to give us a more accurate preview when we're working with our channels here inside of Photoshop CS3. So make sure that's turned off, and then go ahead now and we'll click Next again to jump into the File Handling Preferences. Here inside the File Handling Preferences dialog box, what you want to make sure you come down here and do is change Maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility. We're going to change that to Never. And you want to do that simply because if you maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility, you're actually increasing the size of the Photoshop file, and you're really going to maximize the file size of your Photoshop documents, and it's just going to be kind of a pain if you're not switching between other applications. So you want to change this to Ask if you're switching between applications such as Photoshop and After Effects, Photoshop and InDesign. But for this particular series where we're just going to be working mainly inside of Photoshop and the Adobe Bridge, you don't need this turned on because you're just going to get bulkier files and there's really no need for it. So go ahead and turn that to Never. Now, there's another thing that you can take a look at here inside this dialog box, and that is Prefer Adobe Camera Raw for editing JPEGs. Yes, you can edit JPEGs using Adobe's Camera Raw now. It's an amazing new feature, and we're going to cover that in the Camera Raw chapter. So I'm going to give you the option to turn this on or off now, but after we go through the actual Camera Raw chapter, you might want to go back and turn this on anyway, because you'll see just how powerful an editing tool Camera Raw can be for your JPEG files. But now what we're going to do is we're going to click Next, and we're going to click that twice. And now we're going to come into the Cursors dialog. And inside of the Cursors window, there's a couple of things I want you to be aware of here. The first of which is over here in the Brush Tip options. You have the option of setting it to normal or full size. I actually prefer working with normal, but you can set it to full size if you wish. And what full size does is give you an accurate preview of exactly how many pixels are actually affected by a particular soft edge brush. So you see here it's a little bit wider than the mainstream of the brush. That's simply because this brush right here affects more than just those central pixels that are in the mainstream. It affects all of these outer pixels out here as well. So if you want that full and accurate preview, go ahead and turn that on. I actually don't want to work with that for my particular preference, so I'm going to set that back to normal brush tip. Now, the other thing I'm going to have you turn on in here is the Show Crosshair in Brush Tip. This is going to give you just a more precise cursor, so you know exactly where the center point of that brush is and give you a more accurate way of making brush strokes here inside of Photoshop. The last thing we're going to talk about in this dialog box is the other cursors. Go ahead and change that to precise. This is just going to give you a more precise cursor when you're making stuff like reference points for color and all different types of things like that. So we're just going to turn that to precise so that we have a more accurate way of matching up our color points and all of our reference points that we're going to set throughout the course of the series. Now let's go ahead now and we'll click Next twice again, and we're going to jump into the Units and Measurements panel. In this dialog box, there's only one actual thing that we're going to change here, and that is this ruler measurements up here. We're going to change this from inches to pixels. And we're going to be changing this simply because pixels are the universal unit of measurement in digital imaging, and it's just a whole lot easier to not have to mess with the metric conversions and different things between inches and centimeters and all that kind of mess. So go ahead and change that from rulers to pixels, and we're just going to use that as the basis for all of our measurements as we work throughout this series. Now we can go ahead and we can click Next, actually 3 times, and we're going to get into the type options. In the type options, there are a couple of things that I'm going to set up here as well. We're going to make sure that you have smart quotes turned on. That's just a better rule of typography to have that turned on. And we're also going to take a look down here at the font preview size. Now, by default, in Photoshop, it's set to medium. However, I find that a little bit small for when I'm trying to preview fonts here inside of Photoshop. So what I tend to do is change this to either large or extra large. Now, for those of you who have really bad eyes or just love having absolutely enormous font previews, you can go ahead and change this to huge if you want to. I will warn you that huge takes up almost an entire inch on your screen, so that's just a really extra large preview that you really don't need. I'm going to go ahead and set mine to large. Go ahead and change this option to whatever you feel comfortable with. And then go ahead and actually go into Photoshop and take a look at those previews just so you'll have a better understanding of exactly how big those previews are. And that's going to help you along the way just to switch your fonts easier and give you a much better preview as you're working with type here inside of Photoshop. Okay, now we're going to look at one more preference here inside the Preferences dialog box, and it's just something more or less for me more than it is for you. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to click Next twice to get back to this Interface Preferences here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off Show Tooltips here, because I really don't like that little yellow dialog box popping up every time I mouse over something. However, for you, if you're a beginner especially, this is a great little tip that's going to show up every single time you mouse over something. So if you were to come, let's say over here, and mouse over this, it's going to say whether to save and restore palette locations. It's going to give you a brief description of whatever it is you're hovering over at any given time here inside of Photoshop. So this might be a useful thing for those of you who are new to the program or those of you who just don't know your way around this new version of Photoshop yet. So if you want to, go ahead and turn that on, or keep it on rather, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it off. And that being said, we're now done with all the general preferences. We should all be on the same page. So let's go ahead now, click OK, and continue our look at Photoshop CS3.